It's Kevin with Golden Fly Shop here, tying a little variation on a pheasant tail. This one's got a little less pheasant tail than most pheasant tails. So I've already attached my bead to my hook. So the first thing we're gonna do is attach our .015 lead wire. I'm using here a size 14, 37, 61. And then a matte black tungsten bead. So I'm just gonna make a few wraps of lead, cut off your extra, and then push the tips all the way touching the shank so you don't have any points sticking up. And I'm gonna slide that lead up into behind the bead. I'm going to take my orange UTC 70 and start behind that lead and just build a little bit of a thread dam there. And cut out my extra. And then as far as a tailing fiber goes, I like to use Coq de Lion. Here's a Coq de Lion feather. When I'm taking my fibers from that feather, I like to bend the stem of it until the tips of those are all touching. Once you're happy with that, I'm going to tie in my fibers. I like those to extend about half of the length of the shank of the hook past the hook. We're going to measure that and then secure them. I'm going to use loose wraps over the top and then tighten as I come back around the shank of the hook. That's going to keep my feathers hopefully more towards the top as I tie them in. I'm going to cut off the butts. Next thing I'm going to do is attach the wire I'm going to use to segment this fly later on. Here I'm using a black ultra wire in a size brassy. After I have my wire in, I'm going to also add a piece of medium pearl flashabou. This flashabou I'm going to take over the top of the fly later to give it a flashback. I'm going to make sure that flashabou is tied in at the top of the fly. After that, I'm going to take my pheasant tail. For a size 14, I'm going to use about 5 or 6 pheasant tail fibers. I'm going to cut those fibers so the tips are all even. That just gives me an even tie-in point for my fly. And tie those in at a 45 at the back of the fly. Then bring my thread up to the bead. I'm going to use the rotary function on my vise and bring those pheasant tails up to the top of the fly as well. Just space them out evenly. Once you have your pheasant towards the top of the fly, we're going to take a couple of wraps behind the pheasant tail and a couple of wraps in front of it to secure those fibers. Then cut off the extra at the bead. Take the flashabou we tied in earlier towards the front. I just pinch it down with my thumbnail. Then I use a couple of wraps of thread behind and in front of that flashabou and trim off the extra. Last part that I'm going to bring to the top is that wire. I'm going to counter wrap, so go in the opposite direction. I brought that pheasant tail and bring my wire all the way to the front of the fly. 4 or 5 wraps should be plenty for this fly. Again, a couple of wraps behind, a couple of wraps, a couple of wraps behind, a couple of wraps in front. Then I'm going to helicopter that wire off at the base. You have a nice clean break. Now, time for our dubbing loop. So I'm going to bring some thread out, make my loop around my index finger, 2 wraps in front. I'm going to go over that thread, another 2 wraps around the shank, over that thread, 2 more wraps around the shank. Now our dubbing loop's secured. We're going to remove the memory that was just added to it by untwisting that dubbing loop until you don't see any more coiled thread. At that point, I'm going to take my Swiss CDC multi-loop tool, put it in my dubbing loop so that I can add my squirrel fibers that we cut from our little piece of squirrel body. I'm just going to use my index finger to kind of guide that thread until it's only touching the base of those fibers. If you don't catch all of those fibers, it's not a huge deal. And I'm just going to secure those fibers in my loop and start spinning my tool. After we got those fibers secured, we'll just wrap that dubbing loop around the shank of our hook, working from the back towards our bead. You can push those fibers back towards the rear of the fly as you wrap up. And then once you think you have enough, you can easily secure that dubbing loop with 2 wraps behind and 2 wraps in front before we cut off our excess material. Now I'm going to take all those fibers and bring them to the rear and clean up that bead with a couple of wraps of thread. And now we're going to finish the fly with our whip finish. 2, 3, and then 1 more. And there you have it, a squirrel collared pheasant tail.